It was the morning of August 4th, 1892 in Fall River, Massachusetts, and the air was thick with summer heat. The Borden household on 2nd Street stood like any other respectable home in the bustling mill town, its neat white frame and solid shutters suggesting stability and order. But behind those walls, within the rooms that had seen years of family dinners and church visits, something sinister was brewing. A darkness that would spill out in blood before the day was done. To understand the events of that day, his family lived comfortably, but without the luxuries that his fortune could have easily afforded. His second wife, Abby, was a matronly presence in the home, someone Andrew trusted deeply, though she never found true acceptance from Andrew's daughters. Emma, the elder, was more reserved, while Lizzie, at 32, was intelligent, active in her church, and eager to move up socially. The two sisters harbored resentment toward Abby, suspecting that she married their father for his money and worrying that Andrew's estate would pass more generously to his wife's side of the family than to his daughters. These tensions simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but ever-present, creating a household where civility covered cracks that could split open at any moment. By the summer of 1892, those cracks were wide. Disputes over property, inheritance, and money fueled resentment. Lizzie, in particular, seemed restless. Accounts from those who knew her describe her as moody, often bitter, and deeply dissatisfied with her position in life. She longed for recognition and the finer things, frustrated by her father's unwillingness to move into a more fashionable neighborhood. In that small, confining home, the atmosphere was suffocating. On the morning of the murders, the household followed its usual rhythm, though with an undertone of unease. Bridget Sullivan, the family's maid, woke early to begin her chores. She had been feeling unwell for days, suffering from what was described as food poisoning. But Andrew insisted the tasks of the home must go on. Despite the oppressive heat, Bridget was ordered to clean the windows, a chore that left her drenched in sweat. Upstairs, Abby moved about her business. Andrew left around his customary hour to conduct his business dealings, dressed neatly in his suit and carrying the stern demeanor that had become his trademark. Lizzie, meanwhile, drifted through the house, her presence quiet, almost watchful. At around 9:30 in the morning, Abby ascended the stairs to the guest bedroom. A relative had stayed over the night before, and she set about the task of making the bed and tidying the room. It was here, in this seemingly mundane act, that violence erupted. Struck from behind with a hatchet or small axe, Abby was attacked with savage force. Blow after blow rained down, 19 in total, leaving her skull caved in and her body sprawled on the floor. The brutality of the attack suggested rage, an unrelenting fury channeled through cold steel. Yet no cries were heard, no desperate pleas carried through the quiet house. Whoever swung that weapon ensured silence. Not long after, Andrew returned home. He had completed his errands in the sweltering heat and seemed fatigued as he re-entered the house. He spoke briefly with Lizzie, who later gave conflicting statements about their conversation before settling into the sitting room. Removing his jacket, he lay down on the sofa, closing his eyes for what should have been a moment of rest. But within minutes, he too was attacked. The killer raised the weapon again and again, delivering 10 blows to Andrew's head and face. The violence was so ferocious that one of his eyes was split in two, nearly severed from his face. The room, once tidy and calm, was transformed into a grotesque tableau of blood and destruction. It was a crime committed in daylight, within a home that had only a handful of occupants. And yet somehow it remained unseen. Shortly after, Lizzie called out to Bridget in a voice filled with alarm, saying that her father had been killed. Bridget rushed into the room, and the horror she saw would never leave her memory. The lifeless form of Andrew Borden lay slumped on the sofa, his features unrecognizable, his blood seeping into the upholstery. Neighbors and doctors were summoned immediately, the quiet street erupting into chaos as word spread that something unspeakable had taken place in the Borden home. When they entered the guest bedroom, Abby's body was discovered, lying in a pool of blood, her form grotesquely twisted, her flesh and bone shattered by the relentless strikes. Fall River was stunned. How could such an atrocity occur in a respectable household, in broad daylight, in a town where everyone knew their neighbors? Suspicion settled quickly, and it settled on Lizzie. The evidence, though circumstantial, pointed toward her. She was present in the house at the time of the murders. Her statements about her whereabouts shifted and contradicted themselves. She claimed to have been in the barn when her father was killed, then changed her story to say she was in the kitchen. Witnesses spoke of her attempting to buy prussic acid, a deadly poison, just days before the murders, though the pharmacist refused the sale. More damning still was her demeanor. To some, she appeared too calm, too composed for a daughter who had just discovered the brutal deaths of her father and stepmother. Where others might have collapsed in grief, Lizzie's reactions seemed calculated, detached. And then there was the matter of the dress. A friend of the family reported that Lizzie had burned a dress in the stove shortly after the murders, claiming it was stained with paint. To investigators, it seemed possible that the stains were not paint at all, but blood. The police, though initially hesitant, soon focused their attention on Lizzie as the prime suspect. In a town already captivated by gossip and rumor, her arrest electrified the community. Newspapers seized on every detail, painting Lizzie as either a heartless killer or a tragic woman ensnared by circumstance. The stage was set for a trial that would grip the nation and leave a legacy still debated to this day. In the days that followed the murders, Fall River became a city consumed by whispers. The Borden name, once associated with wealth and respectability, was now on the lips of every townsman, every neighbor, every gossiping voice in the marketplace. Crowds gathered outside the house on 2nd Street, straining to catch a glimpse of the infamous daughter at the center of suspicion. The police, unaccustomed to handling crimes of such savagery, moved through the case with both caution and error. They scoured the house, searching for the murder weapon. Hatchets were found in the cellar, one of them its blades suspiciously broken, but none carried clear traces of blood. In an era before modern forensics, such fragments of evidence were frustratingly inconclusive. Instead, attention focused on behavior, on motive, on the subtleties of character. Lizzie, questioned repeatedly, gave statements that shifted with each telling. She claimed not to know where her stepmother had been that morning, though Abby's body was upstairs the entire time. She spoke of hearing distressing noises, then denied it. She insisted she had seen her father attacked, though the timeline made it nearly impossible. Each contradiction deepened the suspicion. And yet, she also had defenders. Her friends from church described her as charitable, gentle, incapable of such a crime. Reporters, drawn to the scandalous allure of a woman accused of an axe murder, wrote sensational headlines that splashed across the nation. For many, the notion that a middle-class, unmarried, church-going woman could hack her father and stepmother to death was both unthinkable and irresistibly compelling. The investigation stumbled further when police allowed Lizzie to remain in the house after the murders, giving her ample time to dispose of evidence if she were guilty. Within days, she was prescribed morphine by her doctor to calm her nerves. And under the haze of the drug, she gave interviews that seemed at once erratic and oddly composed. Then came the incident of the dress. Alice Russell, a friend, testified that she witnessed Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove days after the murders, claiming it was ruined with paint. To investigators, it was a chilling detail. Was this the very garment worn during the killings, destroyed in an attempt to erase the blood? Public interest grew into frenzy when Lizzie was formally arrested and indicted. The case, already gripping Massachusetts, now commanded the attention of the entire country. Newspapers dubbed it the crime of the century. Reporters flooded Fall River. Sketch artists captured Lizzie's likeness in court. And every new revelation was met with gasps from a public torn between horror and fascination. The trial opened in June 1893 in New Bedford, and the courtroom was packed. Spectators fought for seats, and the proceedings were reported almost word for word by the press. Lizzie entered each day dressed immaculately, her composure never faltering, her face unreadable as the gruesome details of her father and stepmother's deaths were retold again and again. The prosecution argued with determination. They painted Lizzie as a woman driven by resentment, trapped in a home she despised, embittered by her father's stinginess and the looming influence of her stepmother. They described her as calculating, noting her attempt to buy poison before the killings, her inconsistent statements, her suspicious burning of the dress. They asked the jury to consider the sheer impossibility of an intruder entering the house, committing 2 savage murders, and vanishing unnoticed in broad daylight. All signs, they argued, pointed inward, to Lizzie herself. But the defense countered with equal force. They attacked the reliability of witnesses, pointing out contradictions and uncertainties. The supposed purchase of poison was unproven, the shopkeeper's testimony shaky. The broken-handled hatchet was never definitively linked to the murders. There was no blood found on Lizzie's person, no eyewitness, no smoking gun. The defense leaned heavily on character, reminding the jury that Lizzie was a devoted church member, a woman of refinement and good standing. Could such a woman truly lift an axe and strike her father's face until it was unrecognizable? They cast doubt on the investigation itself, criticizing the police for mishandling evidence, for allowing contamination of the crime scene, for rushing to judgment against Lizzie simply because she was convenient. And above all, they played to the sensibilities of the time. In 1893, the image of a respectable woman as a brutal murderer was almost too much for society to accept. The trial became as much about cultural perception as it was about evidence. Reporters described Lizzie's cool demeanor, her calm gaze as witnesses spoke against her. They noted moments where she dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, moments that seemed rehearsed to some and genuine to others. The jury, 12 men chosen from the community, listened intently. They were presented with images of the crime scene, with testimonies about the bloodied corpses, with the haunting suggestion that the person responsible sat only a few feet away from them. The prosecution spoke of motive, of inheritance, of resentment toward Abby, while the defense reminded the jury again and again that motive was not proof. Suspense hung over the courtroom like a shadow. Each day, spectators left buzzing with speculation. Some were certain Lizzie was guilty, others convinced of her innocence. The country waited for a verdict that would echo through history. The summer air in New Bedford was heavy when the trial of Lizzie Borden reached its climax. The prosecution delivered its final blows with dramatic flair, recounting every grisly detail in an attempt to etch the image of Lizzie as a cold-blooded killer into the jurors' minds. They reminded the court of her shifting stories, of the burned dress, of her peculiar calmness in the face of unimaginable brutality. They argued that only someone intimately familiar with the household could have committed such a crime in such silence and with such precision. But when the defense rose for their closing arguments, they wove an equally compelling narrative, one that clung to the very heart of reasonable doubt. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence, no fingerprints, no eyewitnesses, no undeniable weapon. They asked the jury to think not of speculation, but of proof, and proof, they insisted, was absent. They painted Lizzie not as a monster, but as a victim herself, cornered by suspicion, her life dismantled by gossip, her femininity weaponized against her in a court desperate for answers. As the arguments drew to a close, Lizzie herself remained composed, though she had moments when her composure wavered, a hand trembling slightly, her face paling as the brutal photographs of her father's remains were shown once more. When the judge delivered his instructions, the weight of history seemed to press down on the room. The jury retired to deliberate, and outside, a restless crowd surged awaiting word. Hours ticked by. The press speculated furiously, filling columns with predictions of guilt or innocence. Families gathered around dinner tables, whispering about the outcome. When at last the jury returned, the silence inside the courtroom was absolute. Lizzie stood, her gloved hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the foreman as he read the words that would define her life. Not guilty. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by a cacophony of voices outside the courthouse. Some cheered, some shouted in disbelief. Lizzie's face remained strangely unreadable as the verdict was announced. A few accounts say she wept with relief. Others recall her turning pale, almost collapsing. But what was certain was this: she was free. The legal battle had ended, but the war of public opinion was only beginning. Across the nation, people debated the verdict. To some, it was justice, a recognition that the evidence had been too weak, the accusations too circumstantial. To others, it was a travesty, a glaring example of privilege and gender, shielding a guilty woman from the gallows. Fall River itself never fully recovered from the scandal. The Borden name, once one of wealth and respectability, had been irrevocably stained with blood. Lizzie, inheriting a substantial sum from her father's estate, moved with her sister Emma into a grand new home on the hill, a wealthier part of town. They named it Maplecroft, a symbol of escape from the suffocating house on 2nd Street, yet scandal followed Lizzie wherever she went. Neighbors whispered, former friends turned cold, and church doors once open to her now seemed heavy with judgment. Though acquitted, she was never absolved in the hearts of many. Emma eventually left Maplecroft after years of tension, severing ties with her sister. Rumors swirled about Lizzie's friendships and associations, whispers that added to her notoriety. She lived the rest of her days in a paradox, wealthy yet ostracized, free yet imprisoned by her own reputation. The rhyme children chanted in the streets, Lizzie Borden took an axe, echoed like a cruel reminder, embedding her name permanently in the folklore of American crime. When she died in 1927, at the age of 66, there was no vindication, no grand reversal of her legacy. She left behind the same unanswered question that had haunted her since 1892. Did she do it? Historians, criminologists, and true crime enthusiasts have dissected the case for more than a century, combing through every testimony, every inconsistency, every scrap of evidence. Some believe the absence of proof speaks volumes, that Lizzie, with motive and opportunity, was indeed guilty. Others argue the case was riddled with police blunders and biases, that she was an easy scapegoat in a society unwilling to look beyond its own prejudices. The mystery endures because it was never fully solved, because the human mind recoils at such brutality, yet cannot let go of the possibility that the killer walked free, lived among neighbors, attended church, and died peacefully in her bed decades later. And so the story of Lizzie Borden remains not just a tale of murder, but a mirror reflecting human fear, suspicion, and fascination. It is a story of how society judges not only by evidence, but by appearances, by expectations of gender and class. It is a story that refuses closure, that leaves us staring into the void between guilt and innocence, asking ourselves what we believe. And perhaps that is why, more than 100 years later, her name still echoes in whispers, her story still sparks debate, and her image still lingers as one of the most haunting figures in the history of true crime. Decades passed, yet the shadow of 2nd Street never lifted. The house where Andrew and Abby Borden met their gruesome deaths still stood, its walls heavy with silence, its windows staring blankly over the streets of Fall River. Generations later, people still stopped to look, to point, to whisper. The nursery rhyme carried on, children singing words they barely understood, repeating lines that turned unspeakable violence into playground chant. Lizzie herself never spoke publicly about that day. She lived her life in fragments, social circles closing in, her name forever tied to blood and suspicion. The newspapers never stopped reminding the world who she was, who she might have been, and what she might have done. When she died in the year 1927, alongside her sister Emma, who had long since distanced herself, the Borden family line came to a quiet, uneasy close. No deathbed confession, no forgotten letter discovered, no final answer was ever found. What was left behind was only silence, a silence that fed speculation, a silence that allowed the mystery to grow stronger with every passing year. Visitors began to treat the old house not as a crime scene, but as a monument to America's fascination with the unsolved and the unexplained. Tourists walked the very halls where Andrew Borden once slept, where Abby's final breath rattled against the wallpaper, where an axe swung unseen. Paranormal investigators claimed the spirits of the Bordens lingered, their unrest eternal, their story unfinished. But even without ghosts, the house breathed with memory, the air colder in certain rooms, as though time itself had never left. And still, the central question persists, refusing to fade. Did Lizzie Borden kill her father and stepmother? Or was she the victim of circumstance, of misogyny, of a legal system that wanted someone to blame? The jury gave its answer in 1893, but history has never agreed. The case remains open, not in the courts, but in the minds of all who dare to revisit it. Perhaps that is the true power of the Lizzie Borden murders, that in a world desperate for answers, sometimes the most haunting story is the one that can never be solved. As the camera lingers on the darkened facade of 92 2nd Street, the wind rattling its shutters, the audience is left with an uneasy truth. Facts can fade, lives can end, but legends, once born, never die. And in the stillness of that house, more than a century later, it feels as though the axe could fall again at any moment.